Welcome back, dear traveler, to another time journey with History Chibi. Today, we're setting our sights on one of the most influential figures in scientific history, Sir Isaac Newton. You've likely heard his name before, perhaps in connection with the laws of motion, the discovery of gravity, or even the famous apple falling from a tree. But Newton's story is far more than just one of apples and equations. Before we embark on Newton's journey, I'm excited to share a new way for you to become part of the History Chibi community. I've just launched channel memberships, and you can now choose between 3 unique tiers. As a citizen, you'll get loyalty badges, exclusive emojis, and priority replies to your comments. If you join as a senator, you'll get all the citizen perks, plus exclusive access to videos, behind-the-scenes updates, and special member shoutouts in my videos. And for those who really want to dive deep into history, my council members will get everything from the previous levels, plus custom videos on historical topics of your choice, and discounted History Chibi merchandise coming soon, and many more perks. It's a wonderful way to support this channel while also getting access to extra content and exclusive perks tailored just for you. Now, back to Newton. In this video, we'll unravel the full life of Isaac Newton, from his humble beginnings in rural England to his monumental contributions that forever changed the way we understand the universe. Newton's journey is one of brilliance and relentless pursuit of truth. His legacy reaches far beyond just science, touching everything from mathematics and theology to alchemy and political reform. So settle in, relax, and let's travel back to the 17th century to discover the mind, the mystery, and the legend that was Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton's story begins on a cold winter day, January 4th, 1643, according to the calendar we use today, or December 25th, 1642, by the Julian calendar. He was born in the quiet village of Woolsthorpe, Lincolnshire, a small farming community in England. From the start, Newton's life was touched by hardship. His father had died before his birth, and when his mother remarried 3 years later, young Isaac was left in the care of his grandmother. This early separation from his mother may have contributed to Newton's solitary nature and introspective tendencies later in life. As a young boy, Newton attended the King's School in nearby Grantham. There, he quickly distinguished himself not as a typical student, but as someone intensely curious about the world around him. While other children played outside, Newton was known to spend hours building mechanical models and experimenting with sundials, windmills, and even water clocks. His fascination with the mechanics of nature was clear from a young age, and these early experiments hinted at the extraordinary mind he was developing. At 17, Newton's formal education almost came to an end. His stepfather had passed away, and his mother, hoping Isaac would take over the family farm, withdrew him from school. However, Newton's headmaster recognized his talent and convinced his mother to let him return to his studies. Newton's time working on the farm was short and uneventful. He showed no interest in agriculture, and it was clear that his future lay somewhere else. In 1661, Newton entered Trinity College, Cambridge, as a subsizar, working to pay his way through school. Cambridge, at the time, still taught a curriculum rooted in the ancient works of Aristotle, but Newton's curiosity soon led him beyond the standard textbooks. While diligently studying the classics, Newton secretly explored the cutting-edge ideas of his time. He immersed himself in the works of René Descartes, whose mechanical philosophy fascinated Newton, and Galileo Galilei, whose studies on motion challenged traditional views. Newton's time at Cambridge was transformative, particularly in his self-directed study of mathematics. While his formal education introduced him to Euclidean geometry, Newton quickly mastered the subject and ventured into more advanced areas like analytical geometry and algebra. His ability to teach himself complex mathematics at such a young age set him apart from his peers. But Newton was not just a student of theory. He had a hands-on approach to learning, always seeking to prove concepts through experimentation and observation. However, in 1665, his studies were interrupted by the outbreak of the Great Plague. Cambridge University shut down, and Newton, like many students, returned home to Woolsthorpe to escape the epidemic. What could have been a disruption in his education turned out to be one of the most productive periods of his life. In the quiet of the countryside, away from formal lectures and academic pressure, Newton's mind was free to explore his ideas fully. Newton began working on what would become some of his most significant contributions to science. This period in Woolsthorpe, later referred to as his Annus Mirabilis, or Years of Wonders, laid the groundwork for the monumental discoveries that would define Newton's career. Far from the halls of Cambridge, in a small English village, a young Isaac Newton was quietly revolutionizing the world of science. Isolation became an unexpected gift. Away from academic routines, Newton's mind wandered into the depths of some of the most profound questions of science, sparking discoveries that would change the course of history. Newton, who was deeply interested in the mathematical principles behind motion and change, began working on a system that could describe how quantities vary with time. This period saw the birth of calculus, the mathematics of change. Unlike the mathematics that existed before, calculus could explain the motion of objects as they changed speed and direction, laying the foundation for much of modern physics. It allows us to describe how quantities evolve over time, whether it's the speed of a falling object, the growth of populations, or the movement of planets. What set calculus apart from previous methods of calculation was its ability to handle variables that are constantly changing, something essential for understanding motion, forces, and rates of change. These early notes from his time in Woolsthorpe contain the seeds of what would become one of the most powerful tools in mathematics. Though Newton's calculus was groundbreaking, his work remained largely unpublished for many years. It was only when the German mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz developed a similar system independently that the debate over who truly invented calculus began. Leibniz, working in Germany, published his own version of calculus in 1684, and by the early 1700s, it had gained widespread acceptance across Europe. Calculus wasn't the only groundbreaking idea brewing in Newton's mind. During this time, Newton also explored deeply into the study of light and optics. One of his most famous experiments involved passing light through a prism. While it was long believed that light was pure and unchangeable, Newton's experiment revealed something astonishing. The white light that entered the prism split into a spectrum of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet, proving that white light was actually made up of all these colors combined. This groundbreaking work in optics laid the foundation for modern understanding of light, influencing fields like physics and visual arts. His experiments demonstrated that light could be manipulated and analyzed, which later influenced fields like color theory and the study of vision. His work didn't stop there. In 1668, Newton invented the reflecting telescope, a device that used mirrors rather than lenses to gather and focus light. Traditional telescopes of the time, which relied on lenses, suffered from an issue called chromatic aberration, a distortion that caused colors to blur around the edges of objects. Newton's design, which used a curved mirror, eliminated this problem and allowed for much clearer images of distant objects. His experiments revealed that light itself was far more complex than anyone had realized. He showed that it could be broken down into its component parts and manipulated in ways that had never been thought possible. And then, of course, there's the legendary story of the apple. The image of an apple falling may seem whimsical, but it represents Newton's ability to see profound questions in ordinary events. His observation of the falling apple sparked a revolutionary idea, that the force pulling the apple to the ground was the same force governing the motions of planets in the heavens. This simple event stirred something in his mind. Newton began to wonder, why does the apple always fall straight down? Why doesn't it move sideways or at an angle? This question led him to contemplate the force that pulled the apple to the ground, and whether the same force might also affect the motion of the moon and the planets. What began as a question about a falling apple became the seed of Newton's famous theory of universal gravitation. He theorized that the same force causing the apple to fall to Earth was also at work in the heavens, pulling the moon towards the Earth and keeping it in orbit. This idea was revolutionary. It suggested that the laws of nature were not confined to Earth, but applied across the entire universe. It was an idea that no one before him had dared to explore. Newton's law of gravitation provided a mathematical framework to explain the motion of planets and other celestial bodies, fundamentally transforming our understanding of the universe. Newton's equations showed that the orbits of the planets, the motion of the moon, and even the tides on Earth could all be explained by this single law. In 1687, Newton formally published his groundbreaking theories in Principia, which outlined his laws of motion and universal gravitation. It established Newton as the foremost scientist of his time and laid the foundation for classical mechanics, a system that would dominate physics for the next 200 years. Newton's discoveries in optics, mathematics, and gravitation weren't isolated achievements. They were interconnected parts of his broader vision of how the universe worked. He saw the world as a place governed by laws that could be understood, described, and applied universally. From the bending of light to the motion of planets, Newton revealed a universe that was not chaotic, but ordered, elegant, and bound by fundamental principles. So, during those 2 years of isolation, Newton's mind gave birth to some of the greatest discoveries in the history of science. From calculus to optics, from the nature of light to the universal law of gravitation, Newton's Annus Mirabilis was a time of immense intellectual growth, a period where he saw further into the workings of the universe than anyone before him. Though Newton is often remembered for his discoveries, what truly set him apart was his relentless curiosity and his belief that the universe could be understood through observation, experimentation, and mathematics. His scientific exploration didn't just change our view of the cosmos, it showed us how to explore it. By the late 1660s, Isaac Newton had already laid the foundations for some of his most important discoveries, but it wasn't until his academic career flourished that his genius would be fully recognized. In 1669, Newton was appointed as the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, giving him the platform to expand his revolutionary ideas. The Lucasian Chair, one of the most prestigious academic posts in the world of mathematics, was a position Newton held for over 3 decades. The role offered him a rare degree of independence in his research, freeing him from some of the obligations that typically came with university teaching. Though Newton lectured, he preferred working in solitude, away from the distractions of daily academic life. His isolation allowed him to devote his time to his scientific pursuits. As a professor, he was known for his unconventional lectures. Some accounts suggest that Newton's lectures were sparsely attended, with students often leaving early. Despite his formal teaching responsibilities, Newton's real passion lay in his research. During these years, Newton expanded upon the discoveries he had made during his time in Woolsthorpe. He continued his work on calculus, refined his theories on optics, and began to articulate his ideas about universal gravitation. Yet, it was one particular event that would prompt Newton to finally publish his most important work: the visit of Edmund Halley, the famed astronomer. In 1684, Halley visited Newton to discuss the nature of planetary orbits. Halley posed a question that had puzzled scientists for centuries. What force could explain why planets follow elliptical orbits, as described by Johannes Kepler? Newton's answer was swift and decisive: gravity. He explained that a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance between two objects would result in elliptical orbits. This exchange reignited Newton's passion for his gravitational theory. It not only revolutionized physics, but also unified the motion of celestial bodies with the forces acting on objects here on Earth. Newton's laws described a universe that was ordered, predictable, and governed by natural laws. His work provided a new language for scientists, one that allowed them to describe the physical world in precise mathematical terms. Though the Principia was widely praised, it also sparked controversy and debate, particularly with Robert Hooke, a prominent scientist who had previously studied gravity. Newton's relationship with Robert Hooke was marked by rivalry, which was common among leading scientists of the time. While their disagreements were intense, they both made significant contributions to science. Speculation about Newton's involvement in the disappearance of Hooke's portrait remains unproven. This event highlights the intensity of their rivalry. Despite the bitterness between them, Hooke's challenge may have pushed Newton to refine and clarify his own theories further. The dispute did little to tarnish Newton's reputation, but it reveals a more human side to the famed scientist, one capable of holding grudges and responding fiercely to criticism. His feud with Leibniz was also on his mind. The controversy, often referred to as the Calculus War, pitted Newton and his followers against Leibniz, and it became one of the most famous intellectual feuds in history. Newton had developed his version of calculus, which he called the method of fluxions, during his early years in the 1660s, but he didn't publish his work at the time. The controversy erupted when followers of both Newton and Leibniz accused each other of plagiarism. Newton's supporters argued that he had developed calculus first, though privately, while Leibniz's camp claimed that their mathematician had published first and independently. The question of who had done so first led to a bitter dispute that would continue long after their deaths. Though Isaac Newton is remembered for his monumental contributions to science and mathematics, his personal life was quite different from the life of fame and admiration. Newton's deeply private nature and preference for isolation allowed him to focus almost entirely on his intellectual pursuits, though it came at the cost of personal relationships. His personal habits, religious views, and interactions with others paint a complex picture of a man driven by intellectual curiosity but haunted by inner struggles. His relentless focus on his work left little room for close relationships or romance. Those who knew him described him as intensely private and secretive, often absorbed in his work to the point of obsession. His devotion to his research was so all-consuming that he often neglected his physical health, skipping meals, staying up late into the night, and avoiding social activities. In one famous anecdote, Newton became so engrossed in his studies that he once forgot to eat the dinner that had been prepared for him, leaving the meal untouched on the table. Though Newton's brilliance was undeniable, he was known for being sensitive to criticism and could be difficult to work with. His tendency to hold grudges, particularly against those who challenged him intellectually, is well documented. He often believed that colleagues and peers were conspiring against him, and he responded to perceived slights with lengthy, bitter letters. This sensitivity and isolation likely contributed to his reclusive nature as he withdrew further from the public eye to protect himself from criticism. Religion played a central role in Newton's life, but his views were far from orthodox. Newton was a deeply spiritual man, spending considerable time studying the Bible and other religious texts. However, he held unorthodox beliefs that were against the standards of the Anglican Church at the time. In particular, Newton held unconventional religious views for his time, questioning the doctrine of the Trinity. He was influenced by Arianism, a belief that viewed Jesus as distinct from God the Father, which differed from the mainstream religious beliefs of his era. These views put Newton at odds with the dominant religious beliefs of his time, and he kept them hidden for fear of persecution. His private writings on theology, which were not discovered until long after his death, reveal a man who was as devoted to understanding the mysteries of God as he was to understanding the laws of the universe. Newton's lack of close personal relationships has led to much speculation about his personal life. Some have interpreted his lifelong celibacy and reclusive nature as signs of his ascetic lifestyle, a life entirely dedicated to intellectual and spiritual pursuits, with little room for personal or romantic entanglements. His contemporaries, however, noted that Newton seemed indifferent to marriage or family life, focusing solely on his research and religious studies. While some biographers have speculated about Newton's sexuality or romantic inclinations, there is little historical evidence to suggest that he had any close relationships beyond friendships with a few select colleagues. His correspondence with John Locke, the philosopher, and Nicolas Fatio de Dulier, a Swiss mathematician, reveals moments of intellectual camaraderie, but these relationships never seem to extend into the personal or romantic realm. His lack of family ties is another notable aspect of his personal life. Newton was close to his mother, Hannah Ayscough, though their relationship became strained after she remarried when Newton was just 3 years old. His stepfather, the Reverend Barnabas Smith, played no significant role in Newton's upbringing, and the young Isaac was largely raised by his maternal grandmother. This early separation from his mother may have contributed to his emotional distance and reluctance to form close bonds in adulthood. Newton's personal traits, his introversion, obsessive focus on work, and tendency to avoid social interaction were key aspects of his personality that shaped not only his private life, but also his scientific output. His isolation from society allowed him to pursue his intellectual passions without distraction, but it also left him lonely and prone to paranoia. While many scholars today recognize the immense value of his work, they also see Newton as a man who sacrificed personal connections and emotional well-being in his relentless pursuit of knowledge. Despite these personal sacrifices, Newton was never entirely a recluse. He interacted with other scholars through correspondence and occasionally engaged in public life, particularly in his later years when he held positions of authority, such as his role at the Royal Mint. Still, his interactions with others were often tinged with mistrust and suspicion, and his personal relationships remained distant. In the end, Newton's personality and private life remain somewhat mysterious, but what is clear is that his solitude and intense focus allowed him to produce some of the most influential scientific work in history. While he may have been secretive and withdrawn, his contributions to mathematics, physics, and astronomy have endured, securing his place as one of the greatest minds the world has ever known. As Isaac Newton's scientific achievements became widely recognized, his career took an unexpected turn. In the later years of his life, Newton moved away from his reclusive academic life and stepped into public service, most notably through his role at the Royal Mint and his brief involvement in Parliament. This chapter of his life, though less famous than his scientific discoveries, showcases his meticulous nature and unrelenting work ethic, even in areas outside of science. In 1696, at the age of 53, Newton took on the role of Warden of the Royal Mint, a position that would mark a significant shift in his career. At first, the appointment might have seemed an odd choice for someone known primarily for his work in mathematics and physics. However, Newton approached this new role with the same precision and determination that had defined his scientific pursuits. The late 17th century was a time of economic instability in England. The currency had become severely debased due to widespread coin clipping, where people would shave off small amounts of silver from coins and melt it down for profit. This practice had destabilized the economy, making reform a national priority. Newton's task was not simply ceremonial. It involved overseeing the Great Recoinage of 1696, one of the most important currency reforms in English history. Of course, Newton took his role at the Mint extremely seriously. His efforts to stabilize the currency involved overseeing the melting down and reminting of millions of pounds worth of silver coins. In 1699, he was promoted to the position of Master of the Mint, giving him even greater responsibility. Newton's reforms at the Royal Mint, particularly his efforts to prevent coin clipping, played a crucial role in restoring stability and confidence in England's economy by making coins harder to counterfeit. But Newton's role at the Mint extended beyond administrative duties. He was personally involved in pursuing counterfeiters with a zeal that surprised many of his contemporaries. Newton conducted covert investigations, interviewing informants and tracking down those engaged in illegal currency manipulation. His dedication to this cause led to the conviction and punishment of several notorious counterfeiters, including the infamous criminal William Chaloner. While it may seem unusual for a man of science to involve himself in law enforcement, Newton's obsession with precision and order made him well suited for the task. He treated counterfeiting as a personal affront to his sense of justice, and his relentless pursuit of counterfeiters played a crucial role in restoring stability to England's economy. In many ways, Newton's time at the Mint was as influential as his work in science, though it's often overlooked in favor of his more well-known achievements. In addition to his work at the Royal Mint, Isaac Newton also had a brief political career. In 1689, he was elected as a member of Parliament, representing Cambridge University. His election came during a time of great political change in England, following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had replaced King James II with William of Orange and Mary II. Newton's role as an MP was seen as part of the new political landscape, where intellectuals and scholars were increasingly called upon to serve in government. Despite his election to Parliament, Newton's time as an MP was largely uneventful. He represented Cambridge from 1689 to 1690, and again briefly in 1701. During his tenure, he is said to have spoken in Parliament only once, and according to legend, it was merely to request that a window be closed to avoid a draft. This story highlights Newton's lack of interest in political debate and his preference for intellectual pursuits over public life. Though Newton's political career was short-lived and relatively quiet, his presence in Parliament reflected the growing recognition of his status of one of England's leading intellectuals. It was a testament to his increasing involvement in public service, which would continue until the end of his life through his work at the Royal Mint and his leadership of the Royal Society. Newton's transition from a life of scientific discovery to one of public service may seem surprising, but it fits within the broader arc of his career. By the time he took on his role at the Mint and entered Parliament, Newton had already made his most significant contributions to science. His appointment to the Royal Mint allowed him to apply his analytical mind to solving one of England's most pressing problems, and his brief stint in Parliament positioned him as a respected figure not only in the scientific community, but in the broader public sphere. What stands out about this period in Newton's life is his ability to excel in an entirely different field. His meticulous nature, his commitment to detail, and his passion for order and precision, traits that had driven his scientific work, were equally valuable in his role as a public servant. Whether reforming the currency, prosecuting counterfeiters, or serving as a member of Parliament, Newton's later life showed that his brilliance was not confined to the realm of theoretical science. He was a man capable of shaping the very fabric of the nation's financial and political structures. Throughout his life, Newton harbored a deep fascination with alchemy, theology, and prophecy, devoting an incredible amount of time and energy to these subjects. For Newton, the boundaries between science, alchemy, and theology were fluid. He saw them all as part of a broader quest to understand both how and why the universe worked. In Newton's day, alchemy was not the fringe pseudoscience that it's considered today. It was a legitimate field of study, occupying the minds of many intellectuals who believed that the secrets of the natural world could be unlocked through the transformation of matter. Newton spent years conducting alchemical experiments, collecting a vast array of manuscripts on the subject, and writing thousands of pages of notes that he never published during his lifetime. One of the primary goals of alchemy was the transmutation of metals, especially the quest to turn base metals like lead into gold. But alchemy was not just about material wealth. It was also about unlocking the mysteries of the universe. Newton believed that the transformation of substances was a metaphor for the hidden processes that govern nature. In fact, many historians now believe that his work in alchemy helped shape some of his key scientific ideas, including his theories about force and matter. Newton's alchemical pursuits were secretive. He worked alone, conducting experiments in his private laboratory at his home in Cambridge. He rarely shared his findings, fearing both professional ridicule and the potential repercussions of being associated with what was considered a controversial field. While Newton's alchemy may seem out of step with his more scientific work, it's important to remember that in the 17th century, the boundaries between science and mysticism were not as clearly defined as they are today. Newton saw alchemy as another means of seeking knowledge, just like his work in physics and mathematics. One of Newton's most studied texts was the Emerald Tablet, an ancient alchemical document that was part of a broader intellectual tradition of the time. But Newton's alchemical research wasn't fully known until long after his death. Many of his alchemical manuscripts were locked away or dismissed as irrelevant, but in recent decades, scholars have begun to reassess this part of his life, recognizing that Newton's fascination with alchemy was not an eccentric hobby, but a vital part of his quest to understanding the natural world. Beyond alchemy, Newton was also deeply invested in theology, and much of his later life was devoted to studying and interpreting religious texts. He wrote extensively on theology, producing over 1 million words on biblical topics. But just like his alchemical works, these writings remained unpublished during his lifetime, and only came to light in the centuries after his death. Newton's religious writings also reveal his deep interest in biblical prophecy. He believed that the Bible contained hidden messages about the future, particularly about the end of the world. Newton meticulously studied the books of Daniel and Revelation, trying to decode what he believed were prophetic timelines that pointed to future events. Based on his interpretations of biblical texts, Newton predicted that the world as we know it would not end before the year 2060. However, Newton did not see this as an apocalyptic event, but rather a significant transformation of the world, perhaps a time of renewal or great change. However, these ideas were part of his personal theological exploration and are not viewed as prophetic predictions in modern scholarship. Newton's intense focus on theology shows that his intellectual pursuits extended beyond science and into the realm of the divine. It's worth noting that Newton was not only the scientist of his time to be deeply religious. In fact, the pursuit of science and the belief in a higher power often went hand in hand during the Enlightenment. Newton saw the universe as a creation of God, governed by divine laws that could be understood through careful study. His religious faith did not conflict with his scientific work, rather it complemented it. Newton believed that by studying the natural world, he was revealing the work of God. One of the most intriguing aspects of Newton's life is how he bridged the gap between the scientific and the mystical. While his work on gravity, motion, and light is celebrated as the foundation of modern science, his alchemical and theological pursuits reveal a man who was equally concerned with the spiritual and philosophical questions of existence. This merging of science, alchemy, and theology may seem contradictory to us today, but in Newton's time, these fields were all part of the same search for truth. For Newton, the laws of nature and the laws of God were two sides of the same coin. His scientific discoveries were a way to uncover the divine order of the universe, while his alchemical and theological studies sought to understand the hidden forces that lay beneath the surface of reality. As Isaac Newton grew older, his health began to deteriorate, likely the result of years of intense work, sleepless nights, and possibly exposure to toxic chemicals. Many speculate that exposure to hazardous materials during his alchemical experiments may have contributed to his declining physical and mental health. Historical records suggest that Newton experienced symptoms like tremors and memory loss in his later years. Despite these health issues, Newton continued to work well into his 70s, particularly in his role as Master of the Royal Mint. In his later years, he became more reclusive and seemed to retreat into himself, perhaps because of his declining health. He had long bouts of illness and fatigue, but continued to push forward, attending to his duties at the Mint until he could no longer physically manage it. On March 20th, 1727, Newton passed away in his sleep at the age of 84, a remarkable age for that time. His death was seen as the passing of one of the greatest minds in history. Newton was honored with a grand funeral, and fittingly, he was buried in Westminster Abbey alongside Britain's most revered figures, a clear indication of his immense impact on the world. An analysis of Newton's will reveals his careful attention to detail even in death. Though he had no direct heirs, Newton left his estate to various relatives, including nieces and nephews, ensuring that his wealth, accumulated through his work at the Mint and his many investments, was properly distributed. His total wealth at the time of his death was substantial, and his will shows a man who, even in his final years, remained methodical and thorough. In addition to his wealth, Newton left behind an unparalleled intellectual legacy. His contributions to science, particularly in physics, mathematics, and astronomy, had already made him a towering figure in the intellectual world, and his ideas would continue to influence generations of scientists and scholars long after his passing. Isaac Newton's death marked the end of an extraordinary life, but his influence was only beginning. The immediate impact of his work, particularly Principia, was profound. Scientists across Europe quickly recognized the groundbreaking nature of his contributions, especially his laws of motion and universal gravitation. His laws of motion became the backbone of classical mechanics, a framework that would guide science well into the 19th century. The clarity and precision with which Newton formulated his ideas allowed other scientists to build upon them, ensuring that his work would have a lasting legacy. As Europe entered the Enlightenment, Newton became an intellectual hero. Philosophers, writers, and thinkers of the period saw in Newton's work a model for understanding the world through reason and evidence. His scientific methods were seen as a guide for all fields of inquiry, not just the natural sciences. The Newtonian approach, relying on observation, experimentation, and mathematical rigor, became central to the Age of Enlightenment. This movement emphasized rationality and human progress, and Newton's discoveries stood as a testament to the power of the human mind to uncover the universe's deepest truths. Newton's legacy continued to grow in the centuries following his death. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as new scientific fields emerged, his ideas remained a central part of physics. But it wasn't until Albert Einstein's theory of relativity that some of Newton's principles were significantly revised. While relativity introduced a new understanding of gravity and space-time, it also demonstrated how Newton's work had been essential in laying the groundwork for future advancements. Einstein himself acknowledged the debt that modern science owed to Newton, calling him one of the greatest intellects of all time. Today, Newton's influence is everywhere. His name is synonymous with scientific brilliance, and his discoveries are still taught as the foundations of physics. The laws of motion and gravitation remain relevant even in the era of quantum mechanics and relativity. His work is celebrated in textbooks, museums, and academic institutions across the globe, and his contributions continue to inspire scientists and thinkers to push the boundaries of knowledge. Newton's legacy, like his mind, transcends time. His insights shaped not just the course of scientific history, but the way we perceive the world itself. From the Enlightenment to the space age and beyond, Isaac Newton's name remains etched in the history of human achievement. And so, dear traveler, we've reached the end of our journey through the incredible life of Isaac Newton. I hope you enjoyed traveling through time with me today. If you did, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Feel free to suggest other historical figures or moments for our next adventure. And if you'd like to help support the channel, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. Your support helps me keep these stories alive. Until next time, rest well, dream of starlit skies, and I'll see you soon on our next adventure together. Good night.